Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be cooking one of my favourite comfort dishes, which is the humble shepherd's pie. It's quintessentially British. It's a great dish for the winter months. Very comforting, very warming, easy to make. We're going to be cooking up my favourite sort of go-to recipe if I'm in a bit of a rush and I just want to get this done quickly with as minimal washing up as possible. There's loads of variations of shepherd's pies out there. Often people call a cottage pie a shepherd's pie. Shepherd's pie is obviously with lamb, and in the UK people like to make it with minced beef, and that's a cottage pie. Very similar dish, very similar recipe. Obviously you're using a different type of meat, but today we're going to be just doing a really basic but really comforting shepherd's pie, and we've got a really straightforward set of ingredients here that I'm going to talk you through. So we've first and foremost the star of the show, which is the lamb. We've got nice organic minced lamb from 𝑭𝒊𝒏𝒅, which is just down the road. You want to go for quite a high fat content mincemeat, so always ask for the high fat option because that's going to really give you a lot of flavour and depth to the dish. We've got the humble carrot, which I've already peeled, and we're going to be using as much of that today as possible. Obviously normally try and use them from the garden. We're not blessed with too many carrots at the moment, so these are also from 𝑭𝒊𝒏𝒅. We've got a couple of white onions, some garlic, we have just a small amount of red wine. Now I'm going to be using some chopped tomatoes today. Most people would tend to use tomato puree. Honest truth is I quite like having a bit more of a tomatoey rich flavour to the ragu sort of mincemeat, so I'll be using chopped tomatoes. But yeah, a lot of people would just use a bit of tomato puree, but that's all to taste. A few different ingredients. A lot of recipes for shepherd's pie actually recommend using chicken stock. I would always use beef stock with lamb personally, but what we actually have is Josie's homemade bone broth. So we're going to be using a nice homemade bone broth, which will hopefully add a really rich flavour into here, and ultimately is also going to make it that bit more nutritious. On the theme of organic and trying to make this as wholesome and as hearty as possible, we're actually going to be using what's called a Dorset. Here we go. I'm going to say this, a Dorsetshire sauce. And we discovered this when we went on our sort of UPF journey and became quite obsessed with looking at the back of what's in everything. Now, the nation's favourite, if you're from outside the UK, you might not be familiar, but the nation's favourite is the Worcestershire sauce, which is made by Lee & Perrins. Now, most households in the UK will have that in the cupboard. Don't be alarmed, but it does have flavourings in, which ultimately make it a UPF, and therefore I would advise looking at trying to use something that is more natural. This literally, to give you an idea of what's in it, has white wine vinegar, cider vinegar, sugar, tamarind, water, molasses, salt, herbs and spices. So it just gives it that real lift. I think it gives it a bit of umami flavour, and it's just nice to add a dash of that pretty much to any ragu. I would normally add that to bolognese, or if I'm doing a ragu for a lasagna, it's going to be adding that in. And then a couple of key ingredients which I think most professional kitchens would use when doing a shepherd's pie, but maybe a lot of us wouldn't consider. We're going to be using a couple of organic egg yolks in the mash, which on the subject of UPF is going to essentially act like an emulsifier with the mash, a natural emulsifier. You'll see emulsifiers in a lot of foods, and it gives you that creamy texture. Obviously a lot of the time it's a chemical ingredient, or it's an ingredient straight from a lab. Today we're going to use the natural version, so we're going to make that mash really nice and creamy, and it's going to give it that rich texture. And we're going to also add a fair bit of parmesan. Now, something I've kind of learnt cooking this dish for many years now is parmesan obviously adds another umami and a deep flavour to the mash, but it also helps the mash go a nice golden crispy colour. If you don't add parmesan, it doesn't always go that nice colour. I don't know the science of it, but it obviously adds more fat into the mash, so I imagine that's why it goes crispier. So I'm rambling on a little bit, but the important thing is this recipe, I think pretty much anyone can cook this recipe. You don't need any chopping skills. We're going to use a grater today, which is something I learned from the great Gordon Ramsay, no pun intended. And we're just going to grate up the veg. We're going to try and create as little washing up as possible. We're going to use 2 pans, and then we're going to get it in the oven. And the beauty of this, a bit like some of my Christmas recipes, is you could make this the morning of, if you've got people over in the evening. You could probably make it the day before and keep it in the fridge, and then you just put it in the oven for around 20-30 minutes to get it nice and crispy and warm, and then we're good to go. Another nice thing about it is it's just a really nice sharing dish, so I'd recommend getting a dish like this, or a nice deep roasting pan that you can use to create a really nice shepherd's pie, which is just nice to put on the middle of the table and serve it in the pan that you cook it in, which I think is always really nice, and it saves on washing up. Before we start grating the veg and prepping the veg and getting it in the pan, it's probably a good idea to get the water boiling, some nice salted water that you're gonna obviously use for the mashed potato. So we'll get the water boiling and simmering away in the background, good amount of salt in there, then we'll get prepping this, and then things will start to come together very quickly. First of all, we're gonna just take the tops and the ends off these onions, and then we're gonna grate them. If you watch Josie's YouTube channel, you will know that she likes to keep all the odds and ends of veg to make her bone broth. So we're gonna be saving those and try and waste as little as possible, which is always a nice feeling in the kitchen. So you're gonna get your onion like this, and then that's gonna be nice and grateable. Take that off. Just take that little layer off, nice and easy. Of course, the other nice thing about using a grater is you don't have to watch my knife skills, which I think are very much quite amateur, but do you know what? I think that's part and parcel of cooking. You've just got to try things and don't be too hard on yourself. I'm certainly not a professional chef, but it doesn't mean that we don't cook fresh, homely food every evening and every weekend. So, get your onion like that. I've peeled just the first layer off the carrot for this because I don't like that tough texture in this dish. But then we're just literally going to use this carrot and we're gonna grate it. Gonna just open the garlic up. Save all of this for Josie. Now, in terms of the ingredients, this is probably going to be enough for, I would say, about 6 people, or maybe 2 adults and 4 children. That's the same number of people, isn't it? But yeah, this is probably going to be enough for about 6 people, I would say. But to be honest, I don't tend to overthink the number of ingredients. I would say you want a nice amount of onions, maybe 2 large onions. We've gone for 3 carrots. In terms of if you're looking to try and get other veg into this, and I always say that this is probably one of the best dishes, I think, for children, because you can hide a lot of veg in a shepherd's pie. So you could obviously add celery and leek in as well, and then peas in towards the end. So then you're getting 4 lots of veg plus the onion plus the potatoes. So you're making Tim Spector very happy in terms of ticking off those boxes. But for this, we're just going to go for a classic one. So literally, you need very little in the fridge for this, which is why I quite like it as a recipe. We tend to always have these ingredients and maybe just need to add the lamb to the shopping list and then we're good to go. So what you want to do, you want to get a nice pan like this and you're going to get a good glug of oil in there. And then we're going to start grating the veg and get it on. I'd say about a tablespoon. I'm always quite generous with the amount of oil I use. Always use cold pressed organic olive oil if you can, and always try and keep it in a bottle that is a dark colour or opaque, not a glass bottle, which basically protects the nutrients of it for a longer period of time. So then I'm going to use one little gadget here, which is like a gauze glove. I don't know if I used this in my other videos. Essentially, when you're grating things and when you're using a microplane, it protects your fingers. So for someone that's quite clumsy like me, it means you don't take the ends of your fingers off. If you're confident, you don't need one. Otherwise, just make sure you don't go too close with your hands. I'm going to start with the onion, and we're literally just going to use the thickest section, the most coarse section of your grater. And it's super quick doing this. I'm going to keep these slightly tougher edges for Josie. And of course, you could use a knife and you could finely dice this and that would be fine. But I think one of the reasons I like doing it like this is it's just so easy. And if you've got friends or family over, and this, you know, you can get them involved and just get them to do this bit, and you can't really mess this bit up, to be honest with you. So it's often a job I give to Josie. So you'll see there that it's come out quite nice and fine like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to get that straight in the pan and on the heat. Like that. Onto the agar. A little bit of sea salt. So next up, we're going to do the carrots. So same approach. We're literally going to use the coarse side of the grater and try and grate this in a bit longer lines like this, and you get nice stringy bits of carrot which then run through the meat and the sort of ragu element of the dish. As you can see, when you've got one of these gloves, and they're only about £5 online, I think you can get them on Amazon, I'll try and link them down below. It does mean that you can really make the most of the whole bit of veg and not worry as much about getting your fingers. I also think this is a really nice dish to cook if you're going to go and do a weekend away and you want to use the kitchen in the Airbnb or that you might be staying in. Because you don't need a lot of cooking equipment. You don't even really need a particularly sharp knife. All you need is a box grater and you're winning, really. I don't know if you find when you often go and stay in a nice cosy cottage or an Airbnb, they don't often have the best kitchen utensils or cooking equipment. Something that we've tried to address at Strawtop is make sure that there's good equipment in there if you did want to stay in and cook. To be honest, we're actually only going to use 2 carrots because that's turned out to be quite a lot. So, I'm just going to pick that up and stick that in the pan with the onion. So we've mixed the carrot in with the onion, and you basically just want to really soften this up, let the moisture get rid of the moisture from the onion and the carrot. It's going to start to sort of caramelize a bit. You want it on a fairly low heat. Always best to have it on a lower heat, and then you can obviously heat things up. If you start out on a hot heat, you could get in trouble pretty quickly. So yeah, we're just going to keep an eye on that. We're going to put some garlic in there at this point. So we're going to reach for the same box grater that you used before, except on this one, we're going to use the slightly finer one, which can often be used for zesting. I'm going to use that for the garlic. I've got 4 small cloves here. Just do garlic to taste, really, and you're just going to grate that over. So always when you add the garlic, things start to smell really good in the kitchen. I often think that for me, a shepherd's pie or a cottage pie is the perfect comfort dish to prepare in the morning, maybe on a Saturday or even a Sunday if you don't fancy doing a Sunday roast. Get it all ready, leave it in the fridge, and then when you go out for a nice countryside walk, embrace the weather, get a bit chilly, and then come back, light the fire, get the cottage pie or the shepherd's pie in the Aga or in the oven, and then you've got a lovely hearty dinner without quite as much effort and work as a Sunday roast. Of course, if you are a veggie or a vegan, you could easily use lentils and just lots more veg in this recipe. I've seen it done with celeriac, with turnip, with swede, and make it a bit chunkier, and then maybe add some lentils for protein. And you could easily do this dish without meat. Obviously, we're going to be doing it in the more classic sense, but maybe I'll look at doing a veggie one. I've seen, and we've previously cooked a more of an allotment style cottage pie, which obviously doesn't use meat, it just uses lots of veg. I was just saying to Jake off camera that I think this is probably one of the first dishes I ever learnt to cook, because it's something we used to eat at home in my household a lot. And as I say, I think sometimes people view shepherd's pie or cottage pie as unhealthy. I'm not really entirely sure why that would be. It's certainly a heavier, more comforting dish, but there's nothing in my eyes that's unhealthy in this. And you know, if you're using organic produce and limiting any sort of sauces or UPF in this dish, I can't see why this wouldn't be viewed as a healthy, wholesome lunch or dinner. One of the sort of differences with the recipe we're doing today is I'm just going to add the meat in at this point to the veg. Now, some recipes I've seen, some recipes I've previously followed, that you would brown the lamb or the beef first and then remove it and then cook the veg in the fat of the lamb or the beef and then add the beef or lamb back in. I'm not entirely sure of why people do that. It's always worked well for me just to do it all in one pan like this and just do it in stages. So personally, I've always done it this way. And I'm sure there's lots of you that like to do it in different ways, and I'd love to hear in the comments how people do different shepherd's pies. I was saying to Jake once again off camera that, of course, at this point you could add celery, leek, some more veg in there for more nutrients and more flavour. But I think I quite like this recipe because it's minimal ingredients. So that's why we're sticking with just the carrot and onion. But yeah, we're going to add the lamb mince in there now, and then things are going to really start to come together. So at this point, we're going to take it onto a slightly higher heat. If you've got an Aga, rarely do I ever put it fully on like that. Probably only if I was frying a steak, because it can get very hot. So we're going to leave it on half like that and keep an eye on it. If you've got a hob, just turn your hob up slightly. Just going to get that really mixed together and get that meat nice and brown with the veg, and then we're going to start adding our ingredients and things start to take shape and transform. So we are now at the point where we're going to start adding things. Now, I've kind of cheated, I guess. As most of you might know, I don't drink alcohol. Josie drinks limited alcohol and she doesn't drink red wine. So unlike a lot of you that's watching this that might think, oh, we've got our bottle of wine that we cook with on the side, we don't tend to cook with or drink red wine that often. But the positive is we managed to find this, dig this out, which is actually left over from a 𝑭𝒊𝒏𝒅 recipe, which is just 50 mils of red wine. You can use obviously a bit more than that. All you need is a good glug at this point. I'm gonna add that into the mixture and we're gonna boil that off. That's just gonna add a little bit of acidity and a bit of flavor. So get that in there. As I say, you could add a little bit more to taste, but it's gonna add to the flavors of the dish. And then we're gonna add a good glug of gonna give this a go. I struggle. I'm like a lot of Americans call Worcestershire, and we take for granted actually in the UK how difficult some of these words are to pronounce. And as I'm showing now, I struggle as a Brit. Dorsetshire sauce instead of Worcestershire sauce. Sorry, Liam Perrins, I'm not going to be looking for a partnership anytime soon. Sort your life out, sort your ingredients out, and maybe we can talk. So going to give a nice good glug of that, as I say, to taste. But I do like that, we like that, and that adds a nice little bit of acidity to it. Get that mixing in. And then, this is the point where you want to add some sort of tomato. Now, you could roast some cherry tomatoes, you could add them in. You could add plum tomatoes in. You could add chopped tomatoes in, or you could add tomato puree. Whatever you fancy. As I say, I like it when there's a bit more deep tomato flavour to it. So we're actually going to add this whole tin of chopped tomatoes. Some of you might think this is more of a bolognese recipe, and that's fine. As I say, all to taste, all to sort of overall preference. I would say for this quantity, that tin of tomatoes, it certainly doesn't end up feeling tomatoey once everything's cooked off and once you add the stock, but it does add a nice bit of sweetness. So at this point, it should feel like a sauce is really forming, but you're still going to want to add the beef stock, or the bone broth in our case, because that's going to then just add into the flavour. You better simmer it for about 20 minutes or so, and just everything's going to become a lot richer and a lot more flavoursome. However, I haven't tasted this so far, but at this point, I would suggest you give it a taste, make sure the seasoning's right. We're going to be adding some herbs from the garden in a second. Yeah, so that needs a little bit more salt. We'll add the pepper later on. What we're now going to do is we're going to add some of Josie's lovely homemade bone broth, which is going to add a really, really good amount of nutrients to this dish. Stir in as we go. And at this point, this is where we are going to want to add this to the slightly higher heat so it starts simmering away. So we're going to bring that over here onto the slightly hotter hob. Okay, got the fresh herbs, giving it a good rinse. When it comes to the rosemary, I am actually going to chop this up because it's just a bit too big, I think, for this. So we're going to strip that off the stalk. I'm going to finely dice that up. So I say my knife skills are certainly not, you don't come to my YouTube channel for my knife skills, but I always just think you just need a nice sharp knife, keep your hands clear, cut on the angle, good chopping board, don't overthink it. Maybe that can become the new hashtag for the YouTube channel, because I think that's where a lot of people go wrong in the kitchen, and I've certainly gone wrong before, is where you just overthink it and you put too much pressure on yourself, and actually cooking is pretty straightforward when it gets down to it. So we're going to add that rosemary in. We're going to add some nice bit of thyme in there. Give it another 5 minutes and then we'll probably be there and ready to sort of start building everything. So with the thyme, get a nice handful. I'm actually just going to strip it off on the board here. It's a beautiful herb. And to be honest, it's one of the nicest things you can actually have in the kitchen on the side thyme, because I think it just makes the whole kitchen smell beautiful. So we're gonna add a good amount of thyme in. Right, we're very nearly there. Give it a second longer. And the nice thing about this kind of dish is you can't really go wrong. Of course, if you put it on too high a heat, you could burn it. But other than that, there's not much that you can do wrong here. And in terms of keeping an eye on things and making sure everything's going as you'd hope, just keep giving it a taste as things develop. This is getting a lot richer. You know, if you feel like it needs more broth or more stock, add more stock in. Season as you go. Okay, we've got some lovely local potatoes. Potatoes are quite divisive, and I certainly saw that in the comments on the roast potato video. Everyone does seem to have an obsession with 𝑭𝒆 and King Edward. I personally have always just bought whatever potatoes I can get hold of at the farm shop, as long as they're good size and they're not baby or new potatoes. They always seem to mash or roast quite well. But, you know, I wouldn't overthink it. That's my view. So we've got 5 large potatoes here. This is going to be more than enough mash, but I think the key thing is with the shepherd's pie, there's nothing worse than not enough mashed potato, because let's be honest, most of us are here for the mashed potato. So I always think you want almost a half and half quantity. Some people just put a thin layer on and that's fine, but for us, we want a good amount of mash. So we're going to add all these into salted boiling water and boil them roughly about 10 minutes. Okay. With the mash, you do want the steam. You want to give them a bit of time to steam, in the same way that you would with roast potatoes, because ultimately that steam is moisture that's coming off those potatoes. So you want to give it a few minutes for that steam to evaporate before you start, or the steam to disappear before you start adding stuff. We're going to be adding a couple of ingredients into the mash today. So we're going to be adding a couple of egg yolks, organic egg yolks. Now, as I said earlier, they're basically going to act like a natural emulsifier. And by emulsifier, I mean something that's going to add creamy texture to the mash. They also add a nice rich colour to the mash, which is also going to help. I'm going to save the egg white. Keep that lovely yolk in there. So you just want the egg yolk, not the egg white for this mash. And then we're also going to add a bit of parmesan in there. Keep that for later. So we're just going to whisk that up. Okay, set that aside ready. Now we're just going to take a bit of this parmesan off. Obviously, you wouldn't normally cut cheese like that, but when we're going to be grating it, it's not a bad shout. So we're going to grate that parmesan and we can get that ready. Actually take a little bit more of that. One of the reasons we're adding the parmesan to the mash is it's going to add a nice rich flavour and a bit of umami to the mash, but also it's going to mean that the mash goes nice and golden in the oven, which is exactly what you want, and it makes it the ultimate dish to present on the table. Yeah, so we're going to grate that parmesan now. Okay, I'm going to save this bit and we're going to do a bit of parmesan on top of the mash at the end, but we're going to mix this into the mash. So now it's time to get the butter. So we're going to use a fair amount of butter here because that is key to the mash. So I guess in terms of the unhealthy element, if you want to call organic salted butter unhealthy, that is the bit that's not necessarily going to keep your doctor happy, but this is a comfort dish at the end of the day. We're going to add a good amount of salt into that mash. Gonna add some pepper in there as well. Beautiful. Now you just have to get your hands dirty, really. I've seen a lot of people using the Thermomix or food processors for mashing, and personally I'm not a huge fan of that because it ends up making it more like a pomme puree or a creamed potato rather than a mash. I always think you want it to be nice and fluffy, which you should get. But you got to put the work in. Gonna add that egg yolk in there. That's instantly gonna make it go a nice golden colour. Okay, as that mash starts to form, I'm gonna add a nice handful of parmesan in there. And we're going to carry on with the mashing. It's always a good job to do as a double act, actually, and you can let someone swap in. It's a tag team. but we don't want any lumps in here. We're getting there. Gonna add that last bit of Parmesan in. A little bit more pepper. Okay, when we get to this point, you should sort of feel that it's got nice and smooth. We're ready to start layering it up. Now actually, full confession, I got this pan out thinking this would be suitable, but to be honest, this is actually a bit too big. This is probably for enough for 8 people. So we're gonna go and use a slightly smaller dish here. We're gonna layer it up much like you would with a lasagna. So we've got the ragu or the mince over here. Okay, let's make the magic happen. So it's quite straightforward, far more easy than a lasagna. You're gonna get your mince meat, and you're gonna get all of that into your, I guess it's more of a casserole dish than a roasting dish. So we're gonna layer that nice and up, nice and evenly. The smell is delicious. As I said before, you could easily do all of this, obviously get the washing up done. This could all be done in the morning, and then just leave it to one side and then put it in the oven when you want it later on in the day. It's a really nice dish. You could definitely do it the day before as well. So we're gonna spread all that out evenly. Make the most of every last bit. And then we'll come over to the mash, which should be nice and creamy. I've always liked to sort of dollop it in the corners like this, and then we can spread it out with a fork. Nice big amounts like that. Get it all on top. And then you're gonna just get a fork like this, and you're just gonna spread it out like this. And I can promise you it will look tidy once it's done. At this point, it always looks a little bit messy. I've seen people faff around with piping it, you know, do it with whatever way makes you happy. But personally, this is sort of an old-fashioned, tried and tested technique. I think my nan used to do this. And I promise you it will look lovely when it's cooked. So just work the mashed potato around. Now you do want to try and make sure it really covers right up to the edge. Okay, now we're just gonna cover that in a bit more Parmesan. Obviously this is optional, but this, for me, just adds another layer of comfort to this dish. And you want to come away from having this feeling like you've had a really hearty meal. So we're gonna top it with Parmesan. This is the bit where things get a bit messier. And then we're gonna get that in the oven. Now, I'm not a big one on oven temperatures, but I think you probably want this in the oven around 200 degrees. We're gonna be putting it in the Āga, and the top Āga oven, the roasting oven, is around 200 to 220, I believe. So we're gonna stick that in, and then things are gonna start to go nice and golden, and we're nearly ready to serve. There we have it, the ultimate comfort dish, quintessentially British shepherd's pie. This is very much a classic recipe, something that has been cooked for generation after generation after generation. And as I said earlier in the video, I don't think it's unhealthy. It's comforting, it's warming, it's fulfilling, and it's perfect for the colder, gloomier months of the year. We're gonna get cracking and dig into this. And if you'd like to see more recipes like this, more quintessentially British recipes, more tried and tested recipes, then hit subscribe, hit like, and we'll see you in the next one.